From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm Maria Rana, and this program is brought to you by the Librarians Hispanic Initiative, which was a program that was instituted a few months ago by Dr. Billington. And the Librarians Hispanic Initiative became a working group of 15 people from all around the library, from all kinds of cultural backgrounds, working on this notion that Dr. Billington has of improving perhaps our service to the Hispanic community of the United States and to representing it better than we already do, which is quite a remarkable representation, if I may say so. The characteristics of what makes this institution so great is its breadth and its depth of its collections. But another very strong characteristic that Dr. Billington pointed out in his announcement about the Hispanic Initiative, the Librarians Hispanic Initiative, is that the force and the breadth and the depth of the people who work in this institution, the knowledge and the experience and the cultural diversity of the Library of Congress is something that we want to maintain and improve, and that's exactly why we're here. I think Dr. Billington sees the Hispanic Initiative as being a kind of model, if you will, or pilot, if you will, of much work that needs to be done in representing the great cultural diversity of this land. And it is a way to get into perhaps all the rest of the work that we need to do to represent all the communities that represent this country. So, as we know, the Library of Congress is the largest repository, and sometimes we have to keep reminding people of this, the largest repository of materials on Latin America in the world. It has an extraordinary Hispanic reading room, which services scholars around the world who come to it. And it has, it's known for its rich and very comprehensive collection of Luso-Hispanic materials in general. So when we say we need to improve the representation of cultural diversity, and especially of Hispanics in the Library of Congress, we're already starting from a huge and well-represented base. I think what we need to do, what we feel we need to do now, is reach out to the community a little bit more. And in the process of reaching out to that community, we need to know who they are, who we are, who what part of America is made up of the Hispanic community. So that's why we're here today. We've got a wonderful program, distinguished speakers and scholars from the Pew Research Center, Hugo López and Ana Brown, who are going to be speaking to you today. And to introduce them to you is our very own Roberto Salazar from the Office of Inclusion. So Roberto, where are you? Thank you.
Good morning. You know, as the Library of Congress looks forward, I don't think it will be enough for us to simply be the nation's oldest federal cultural institution. Rather, we must become the nation's most relevant cultural institution. And to do so will require, in part, that we engage this fast-growing community of Hispanics in our nation. I think we have an opportunity and certainly an obligation of sorts to demonstrate how the Library of Congress is capturing, preserving, and curating their history and contributions to our great nation. A few weeks ago, the Pew Research Center, an independent and unbiased think tank, released a report titled Public Libraries and Hispanics. And the report explores patterns of public library use among Hispanics ages 16 and older, and their attitudes, opinions, and views about the role of public libraries in their communities. We're honored to have the report's authors here with us today to present their findings. Anna Brown is a research assistant with the Pew Research Center's Hispanic Trends Project and the Pew Research Center's Social and Demographic Trends Project. She earned her BA in politics with honors from Oberlin College, and she is pursuing a master's degree in survey methodology at the University of Maryland. Mark Hugo López is Director of Hispanic Research at Pew Research Center. He studies the attitudes and opinions of Latinos, Hispanic views of identity, the political engagement of Latinos in the nation's elections, and Latino youth. Dr. López also coordinates the Center's National Survey of Latinos, an annual nationwide survey of Hispanics. He was the research director of the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, also known as CIRCLE, as well as a research assistant professor at the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. Dr. López received his doctorate in economics from Princeton University. He is also an author of reports about Hispanic electorate, Hispanic identity, and immigration. Dr. López frequently appears in national and international media in both Spanish and English. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our featured guests.
Thank you for the fabulous introduction. Anna Brown is right here with us. She's going to be speaking a little bit later towards the end of the presentation. I'm going to kick off the presentation with a little bit of an overview of both the Latino community nationwide and also many of our results that we found in our particular report. So let's go ahead and get started. First, about the Hispanic Project at the Pew Research Center. It's been around for some time, since about 2001. We're funded entirely by the Pew Charitable Trusts. Our mission is to provide data and information to understand the nation's Latino community, how that community is changing the United States and how the United States is changing that community. We also like to call ourselves a fact tank rather than a think tank, meaning that we don't take any positions on policy. So if somebody asked me today about what we might want to do about immigration reform, I might have to say, I don't know. But that's only because we take no positions. We're non-advocacy and nonpartisan. So let's talk a little bit about the nation's Latino community. As you know, the nation's Latino community today makes up about 17%, it's actually more than 17% of the nation's population. There's more than 54 million people who trace their roots to Latin America and who call themselves Hispanic or Latino. Now, the Latino population is growing fast. It's one of the fastest growing populations in the U.S. Between 2000 and 2010, for example, the Latino population grew by about 43%, but it alone accounted for about half of the nation's growth in population between 2000 and 2010. Now, you can see how young this population is, which I think is one of the big characteristics of this population, just by looking at different slices of the American population. So, for example, among people ages 25 and older, Latinos make up 13% of that population. But among people of college-going age, those 18 to 24, they make up 1 in 5 people in that cohort. Next, if you take a look at, for example, people ages 6 to 17, you'll see Latinos are 22% of that population, and among those, the youngest, ages 0 to 5, you'll find that Latinos are 25%, 1 in 4 of that population. So you could really see that the nation's Latino population is a young population, and one that's going to be important in shaping the future of this country in a number of different ways. Now, looking forward, what does the Census Bureau project is going to be the population share of Hispanics into the future? So by 2060, the Census Bureau is projecting that Hispanics will be about 29% of the nation's population. Now, this is interesting because actually these numbers are slightly down from what the Census Bureau had been projecting just a few years ago, and really it's a reflection of the slowdown in migration. So Latinos are still a growing part of the nation's population, but that growth is somewhat moderated because of a slowdown in immigration to the United States from Latin America. Now, you can really see this when you take a look at sort of the share of the Hispanic population that's foreign-born. Sometime during this last decade, we saw the share of the U.S. Hispanic population that's foreign-born peak, somewhere at around 40% among all Hispanics, and among adults about 55% right before the recession. Since the recession, though, the share of the Hispanic population that's foreign-born has started to decline. Now, the reason why I'm talking about these demographic trends within the Hispanic community is because some of the key findings in our report were related to where people were born and also some of the characteristics of Hispanics that might be playing a role in how often and how much they use libraries and also what they think about libraries. Now, the interesting thing about this is that another way to look at this is that where has Hispanic population growth been coming from? In the 1970s, it was just about evenly distributed between U.S. births and immigration. During the 1980s and 1990s, there were many more immigrants arriving in the United States from Latin America than there were births to Hispanic women in the United States. So immigration was the major driver of Hispanic population growth. But in the 2000s, things turned around. And this is only going to become more accentuated as we move forward. The Hispanic population is becoming more and more U.S. born. And that's really, I think, an important characteristic to note, because while we talk about Hispanics and Hispanic immigrants, half of Hispanic adults today are actually U.S. born. And as we move forward, the U.S. born are going to play a bigger role in shaping everything about the Latino community, from their opinions to their politics to how they, what schools and universities they attend. Do they get bachelor's degrees? All of these are going to be very, very important for the nation moving forward, and it's important to note the role of U.S. borns in driving these numbers. Finally, one of the other key characteristics is language, and this is an important part of the story for Latinos because obviously Spanish is a big part of the story for Hispanics overall. Now, in our surveys of Hispanics that we conduct annually, we ask people about their language use. Specifically, we ask about whether or not they can read something in Spanish and whether or not they can understand spoken Spanish well, very well, etc. And the same two questions for English. Together, it allows us to get some sort of a measure of which language people are dominant in. And you can see that for Hispanic adults, 38% are Spanish dominant, 38% are bilingual, and 24% are English dominant. But that among the immigrant generations, you'll see a difference in language use. So for example, first generation, which are immigrants themselves, you'll see that 61% are Spanish dominant, 33% are bilingual, and just 6% are English dominant. No surprise, it's what you might expect for an immigrant population from Latin America. By the second generation, which is the children of immigrant parents, you see that 53%, the single largest group, are bilingual. And then among third and higher generation, these are young people, or Hispanics, I should say, who are U.S. born with U.S. born parents. 69% of them are English dominant. So you can see that across the generations, particularly among the U.S. born, bilingualism and English dominant Hispanics are more common than Spanish dominant Hispanics among the U.S. born. The U.S. born, by the way, are the second and third and higher generation groups. So clearly language is an important part of this. But what's the future hold for Spanish among Hispanics? Well, today about 38 million Hispanics speak Spanish at home. These are people ages 5 and older. And that's about 3/4 of the Hispanic population. But the Census Bureau projects that as we move forward, these shares are going to change. Currently, 74% of Latinos live in a household where Spanish is spoken, but it's projected by 2020 that number will fall to 66%. What about speaking only English at home? 25% today speak only English at home, but that number is projected to rise to 34% by 2020, according to the Census Bureau. Now, what's interesting about this is that these numbers and these projections are really not that far off, if you think about it. But it only shows you how quickly the Hispanic population is likely to change, particularly because immigration from Latin America has slowed so much. Now I'm going to switch gears. I want to talk to you a little bit about our public libraries report and some of the findings that we had in our report. Now this is based off of a survey of 6,200 Americans that was conducted nationwide. These are people ages 16 and older. It included 739 Hispanic adults. The survey was conducted in both English and Spanish. So survey respondents had the option to conduct the interview in either English or in Spanish when they were contacted. We also conducted it on both landline and cellular telephones. Of course, this is very important for Latinos because many Latinos live in households where only a cell phone is available. It was fielded in the late summer of 2013, and this is only one of many reports that we've produced on libraries in the United States. Now, this is focused on public libraries and Hispanics, but there are many other reports that you could find at libraries.pewinternet.org that look at many other aspects of the U.S. population and how they see public libraries, what they value most in libraries. There's even a library typology quiz if you'd like to see where you fit on the library typology quiz. So there's a lot of really good information available at libraries.pewinternet.org. So in our report, we wanted to take a look at how Hispanics use public libraries. Do they go to public libraries often? What are the patterns of use overall? We ask about it in two ways. We ask about it first if you've ever visited a public library or a book mobile, and we also ask about public library websites and visiting those. So first, what about visiting a public library? Overall, 72% of Americans ages 16 and older said that they had done this at some point in their lives. But there's a difference among Hispanics when you take a look at it by nativity, where people were born. U.S.-born Hispanics, 83% say that they've visited a public library, but 60% of foreign-born Hispanics say that they've visited a public library. This difference is statistically significant, so the foreign-born are somewhat less likely, though a majority of them say that they have, to visit a public library. One interesting thing I think about this is how similar the U.S.-born Hispanics are to whites and blacks. Overall, U.S.-born Hispanics look just like whites and blacks in a lot of ways in this particular survey. It's really foreign-born Hispanics who seem to have different usage rates and also different views of public libraries overall. Now, what about using a public library website? Well, here we see a similar gap. Of course, people are less likely to have done so overall. So for Hispanics, 38% overall say that they've visited a public library website. 27% of immigrant Hispanics say that, compared with 49% of the U.S.-born. But again, you can see a very similar pattern here. The U.S.-born look a lot like their white and black counterparts. However, foreign-born Hispanics are less likely to have visited a public library website. Part of the reason for this, though, is that the foreign-born, according to other surveys that we have conducted, are less likely to have access to the internet. So that's part of the challenge for accessing a public library website. But nonetheless, it's a similar pattern to what we see for actually having visited a public library overall. Now, what about having a library card? Because obviously, one other way to access a library and show interest in accessing libraries is whether or not people actually have a library card in their possession. And you can see here that for Hispanics overall, again, a very similar pattern. Overall, they're less likely to have a public library card than their white or black counterparts, but if you take a look at it by nativity, U.S.-born Hispanics are just as likely as their white and black counterparts to have one, compared with the foreign-born. 40% of them have a library card. There are also some other differences by age and by education. Particularly, you can see, for example, male Hispanics are less likely to be in possession of a library card than their female counterparts. Also, you see that the young are more likely to be using library cards than older Hispanics. That's partly tied to nativity, because younger Hispanics are more likely to be U.S.-born. Also, there are some differences by educational attainment. Those with less than a high school diploma, only 30% of them have a library card, for example. So some differences within the Latino community, but once again, this similar pattern of foreign-born Hispanics less likely to be in possession of a library card. U.S.-born Hispanics are just as likely as their white and black counterparts to have a library card. Now, how often do people visit public libraries? How often do people actually go to public libraries? And you can see here that, and this is among people who actually use a library, there's no difference in this case between foreign-born Hispanics, U.S.-born Hispanics, whites, and blacks. If somebody is a library user, the frequency of use does not vary by race or ethnicity. So for example, among all Hispanics, 45% say, who are library users, 45% say that they visit the library at least monthly. Now that's true of the foreign-born at 47%, and keep in mind these are foreign-born library users, and 44% of U.S.-born Hispanic library users. Those numbers are similar to what we see for whites and blacks as well. So again, there isn't much of a difference here once you get somebody to the library. So use of the library is pretty much similar once you get them to the library across all of these different groups. Now, one other question we asked about in the survey was how easy is it to use a library? And this was asked of all Hispanics. Did they think it would be easy to actually go visit a library? Now, this is people self-assessing, so hey, how easy would it be for me to go? Well, let me see, would it be very easy or not? And here are the results that we got. First, among all Hispanics, 47% said, and this is among all ages 16 and older, not just library users, but all Latinos ages 16 and older. 47% said that it would be very easy to visit a public library in person. But again, we had a difference between the native-born and the foreign-born. 1/3 of the foreign-born say this, as do 60% of U.S.-born Hispanics. So once again, a gap. And the U.S.-born look a lot like their white and black counterparts in terms of ease in which they feel that it would be easy to use a public library. What about visiting a public library website? Again, very similar pattern here as well. Foreign-born less likely to say this would be very easy to do, compared with U.S.-born Hispanics who say that are more likely to say it'd be easy to do, that is, to visit a public library website. And again, the U.S.-born are closer to their white and black counterparts, though here they somewhat lag compared to some of the other questions that we've asked in the survey. What about knowing where your public library is? Now, of course, all these are questions that we're asking all of these to try to get a sense of the landscape of why people are not using or why people do use public libraries. Could it be that the foreign-born are less likely to use public libraries because they're just not close to them or they don't know where they are? Well, in our survey, a majority of the foreign-born say, yeah, they know where their local public library is. 73% of them say that's true. They know where it is. But you'll see that it's a lower share than what you see among U.S.-born, white, and black, U.S.-born Hispanics, whites, and blacks overall. About 90% of those other three groups say that they know where their local public library is. Now, in terms of how close that library is to you, here you can see that it may not necessarily be distance. It may just be a lack of knowledge about the location of the public library. Because among those who know where it is, the distribution of the distance is pretty much the same across all these different groups. 81%, for example, of immigrant Hispanics say that their local public library is within 5 miles or less of their home. So for immigrant Hispanics, knowing where the public library is one of the barriers to not necessarily using them. They're less likely to know where it is, even though a majority of them, almost 3/4, say they know where the local public library is. But again, that's substantially below what we see for other groups. Now, we not only asked about visiting public libraries, but we also asked about services of public libraries. What do people think about the services that are offered? And here, there's some interesting results, some very, very interesting results. First, the foreign-born Hispanics who use libraries rate services higher than anybody else. And this is true across the board, about having a safe and quiet place to be. 85% of Hispanic library users say that that's a very important service to them and their family. That's a higher share than any one of these other groups. What about research resources? 82% of immigrant Hispanics say that that's a very important service to them. And you can see across the board on all of these, Latino immigrants are more likely to rate these services as very important to them and their families than either whites, blacks, or even U.S.-born Hispanics. A very interesting set of findings here. So this is why we started our report with the lead that went something like this. Immigrant Hispanics present both a challenge and an opportunity to the library community. Because on the one hand, they present the challenge because they don't necessarily use libraries as much. They're not necessarily as sure of where they are. But on the other hand, once they come to libraries, they value them more than the general U.S. public does, particularly when it comes to the services that are offered at those libraries. So it's interesting how you have this interesting pattern of results, which I think are really quite striking and also quite fascinating. What about knowing about the services that are available? Now, knowing about the services that are available, here there's somewhat of a difference. Latinos are less likely than whites or blacks to know about the services or programs that are available in their local library, but the difference between the foreign-born and the U.S.-born is really not quite as large here as we've seen in some of the other questions that we've asked throughout the survey. What about how Hispanics view public libraries? What are their views of public libraries overall? Do they think public libraries are good for their communities, and what would be the impact of libraries of closing on their communities? Well, first, what about their feelings about libraries overall? We asked a number of questions of survey respondents, asking them to assess whether or not they agree that libraries do these particular things. For example, promote literacy and a love of reading. Most Americans, whether Hispanic or not, say, yeah, you know what, that's true. Libraries do promote literacy. They strongly agree that libraries do promote literacy and a love of reading. For Hispanics, that number is 80%. No real difference between the native-born and the foreign-born. What about giving everyone a chance to succeed? Also here, pretty much no difference across groups. On some things, though, there are some differences. For example, libraries are not needed because information can be found elsewhere. So this is really kind of an interesting result because Hispanics, and particularly foreign-born Hispanics, are more likely to say they strongly agree with that statement about libraries, even though they're less likely to use libraries. So there's this interesting juxtaposition again of, on the one hand, not using libraries as much, perhaps because the information can be found elsewhere, but also when they do use them, really valuing the services that are offered more than other groups. So some interesting findings here when it comes to the feelings and views of libraries overall, and juxtaposed against their views of services and how much they use those libraries. What would happen if public libraries in a local community were to close? So this is a sense of how important the libraries are for different communities. Now, we asked people to assess this for their families, but also for their communities overall. And you'll see that for Hispanics, 40% said that the impact would be a major one on them and their family if their local public library closed. 65% said the same thing about the impact being major if on their community if their local public library closed. Now, what's interesting about this is that the foreign-born are more likely to see a major impact, whether it's on their family or on their community. And this question was asked of all survey respondents, so it isn't just library users. So interestingly, 73% of Hispanic immigrants say that if their local public library closed, it would have a major impact on their community. Half say that if their local public library closed, it would have a major impact on them and their family. Those shares are higher than what you see for the U.S.-born Hispanics or for whites or for blacks. Again, similar pattern here where foreign-born Hispanics stand out and are different than the other three groups that we looked at in our particular report. I'm going to hand over the podium to my co-author, Anna Brown. Anna, by the way, is the mastermind behind a lot of this report. She was the lead author in this report, and she's going to talk to you a little bit about the demographics of library users. So we've taken a look at the opinions and attitudes of these library users. Now we're going to turn around and show you, so who are Hispanic library users? What are their characteristics? So kind of turn it around the other way. So Anna. Mm-hmm.
All right, so we compared the library users with the non-library users among Hispanics and then among the general public as well. So we only asked the question about if they were foreign-born or U.S.-born of Hispanics, but we found that they were disproportionately born in the U.S. for the library users. Library users tended to be more educated, and you see the same pattern among the general public, but not quite to the same extent. That the people with some college or more were overrepresented. And then in terms of the type of technology they use, they look pretty similar to the general public as well. And we see that females are a little more likely to use the library, and that is also true of the general public. And then library users who are Hispanic are much, much more likely to be on the younger side compared with the general public. And so we can see here that 39% of Hispanic library users are 16 to 29, compared with only 24% of the general public. And then in terms of the types of devices that can be used for e-reading, Hispanics look pretty similar to whites and blacks. Hispanics are slightly more likely to use tablets, and especially the foreign-born Hispanics are. And I think that's it.
Great. Thank you, Hannah. And that's the end of our presentation. Look forward to your questions. But again, just to summarize sort of what our key findings are here. One of the big findings is that immigrant Hispanics have different patterns of use and different patterns of views about public libraries in either U.S.-born Hispanics, whites, or blacks. And what's most interesting here, I think, is on the one hand, immigrant Hispanics are less likely to be library users, but once they do use libraries, they're the most appreciative of the services and programs that are offered at U.S. public libraries. I look forward to your questions, and thank you very much.
Let's give a round. Since I have the microphone, I'll start with the first question, and then we'll work around the room. I noticed a correlation between dominant Spanish-speaking foreign-born Latinos and the lack of ease in using or accessing public library websites. Is that a language issue and the lack of availability of Spanish material on websites?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It could very well be a lack of Spanish language websites or availability of a Spanish language version of a website. We don't know from this data because we didn't ask about that, so I can't say for sure. I do think, though, that there's another component that's playing a part in this, or a role in this. Spanish language, Spanish dominant, I should say, Hispanics are actually less likely to have access to the internet. So they're oftentimes about 15 to 20 percentage points less likely to be internet users than their US-born or English-dominant counterparts. So Spanish speakers just don't access the internet as often, and that may be contributing as well to this having difficulty visiting or very rarely visiting a public library website.
Other questions?
Maria Rana pointed out that libraries, in particular Library of Congress, could possibly do a better job of reaching out to the Latino community. And I wonder if you would go back to that slide that has to do with the services that Hispanics find less useful than others. I saw one of them being the recruitment services for children. I think that's an important slide that we should focus in on because those are the areas I think that may be weak areas for libraries. And I wonder if you would comment a little bit on that and some of the things that we could do to strengthen our outreach in that area.
So this is the slide that you were talking about, correct? This is the one with the different services. Yeah, there's some really fascinating findings in this battery of questions. So particularly for immigrant Hispanics, programs for youth and programs for adults seem to be two areas where they really value those particular services. Also, internet computers and printers. Interestingly enough, because the foreign-born are probably less likely to have a desktop at home. So to do something on a computer, this is where they come to the library in order to access a computer or access the internet through the public library. One other thing that I did not show you in terms of results is we also asked about a number of things that people might do when they gather information. And one of the interesting things about the survey is it asked about, for example, help in finding a job, help in starting a business, help in applying for government programs. And in all of these are areas where the foreign-born say, you know, they're somewhat less likely to ask for it than the U.S.-born, but it's something that I think might be a road to actually accessing or getting the foreign-born to come into the public library by offering some of these very specific librarians are here to help you with finding information about jobs. Finding information about how to apply for government services, finding information about how to file your taxes, all things that perhaps might be a source of contact with immigrant Hispanics. So the results here, particularly about programs for youth and programs for adults, I just found these really I was like, wow, that's really kind of neat. And it all kind of fit in, I think, together with a lot of other things that we know about the foreign-born Hispanics, which is less likely to be on the internet, for example, less likely to have a desktop at home. All of this seems to me to fit in with that. So.
Hi, thank you for your work. I'm Laura Clark at the American Library Association, so I've been around a lot of this data for a while, and it's a fantastic resource for all of us. I had a question if you could link this data to some of the other work within the Hispanic research area, specifically when we think about this communication gap around outreach. You know, when you think about how do we better reach both U.S.-born and foreign-born Hispanics to get the word out? Like what kinds of communications channel, whether that's radio or social media, thinking again about the youth, can you connect a little bit around some of the communications channels and how we more effectively reach this community?
Very good question. Let me tell you a little bit about some of our research work on where Latinos go to get information and news, which I think relates to connecting and outreaching to them, though we haven't specifically done research on what you're asking about. So among foreign-born Hispanics, television news is by far the most popular platform for gathering news and information. More than 85% of Hispanic adults who are foreign-born will say that that's where they go to get their news. And oftentimes, if they're going to that platform, television, it's the only platform or one of only two platforms that they go to. Contrast that with U.S.-born Latinos who go to many different platforms to get their news. They'll go to the internet, for example, and they'll do so in English. They'll go to radio. They'll go to print more than foreign-born Hispanics will. Television is actually declining as a source of information for U.S.-born and English-dominant Hispanics. So we have found that there are some major changes underway with the ways in which Latinos are gathering news and information. On the one hand, places like Univision and Telemundo will continue to be strong because they have there's so many people who speak Spanish, and that market is such a large market. But what seems to be changing is that the new cohort or the younger cohort of Latinos entering adulthood are oftentimes going to many different sources and doing so in English. So the young Latino is going to be on the internet gathering information, is going to be looking at print newspapers or looking at or listening to radio to get that information. Also, what language do they tend to do it in? Particularly second and third generation Latinos, when they watch television programs, for example, they tend to do so in English. When they listen to music, they're somewhat more likely to do so in Spanish than they do on television, but still majority get their music mostly in English.
Hi, I was wondering if the public libraries that are serving, especially the foreign-born Hispanics, if they actively market their services in Spanish, and do you have data on the provision of either formally or informally Spanish-speaking librarians?
That's a fascinating question that, unfortunately, the survey didn't get at. I only have anecdotal evidence on this, and my sense is that there's a lot of public libraries that don't necessarily have a lot of Spanish options available, and that may very well be part of the reason why in our survey some people say, especially foreign-born Hispanics, say, hey, it's not so easy to get to or to use a public library. I wish we had that information in this particular survey, like asked, well, why is it not so easy? Is it because of lack of Spanish language availability? But I do think that for many public libraries, either there's just a few offerings in Spanish or there are no offerings in Spanish. And again, it's anecdotal evidence of me just walking into a library and seeing relatively little on that front.
I just had a question relating to language, acquisition of language. I see with the foreign-born that the lack of English skills can be a barrier. Do you think that libraries have a role in language instruction?
I think that they very well could. And in fact, there's a lot of demand within the Latino community, even though immigration has slowed, for English language courses. If you just watch Univision or Telemundo at night, you'll see a lot of advertisements for local classes in English. So certainly I do think that there could be a role. Now, I have no idea how prevalent such courses are across the country. Maybe you want to jump in? Yes? Go ahead. Go ahead.
There's two pieces of data that might complement this on the library side. One piece to an earlier question about outreach to Spanish language people is there was research many years ago now that looked at library services in languages other than English, and Spanish was the most common that was offered, but they looked across all language areas. And so there's some data, it's a little bit older now, it's probably about 6 years old, that looks at that question if people are interested. But there's a current survey in the field through the ALA and the University of Maryland College Park that looks at library services broadly, and ESL is one of those. So that there's one question that specifically asks about that, as well as GED, STEM, other education type programs, as well as workforce. But it doesn't get down to, it's really what the library provides as opposed to what are people taking advantage of. So the thing that I really like is that a lot of the data that we do on the library side really matches nicely with what are the needs and what are the uses within the Pew Internet. So it's a nice connection.
Yeah. On the Spanish language services, so that's the most commonly offered, but how prevalent is it across libraries?
Well, I don't have the answer to that in my head, but I could share it.
Okay.
But I would say that the thing that was most interesting for this is that people think particularly where there is a strength is in urban areas. But where there's an increasing population, this trend of the population is across the country. So where you see the greatest gap, it's really in smaller and rural, particularly if you're thinking about folks that are library.
Right.
So the gap is the greatest in some of the smaller libraries around this language
Yes.
availability and
Yes.
people who are comfortable speaking.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense, and also it matches other patterns that we see in other services that are provided within the Latino community. So, for example, the Los Angeleses of the world tend to be providing more services because there's been demand for it much longer. But then in other places, like in Nebraska, for example, this is where oftentimes, say, ESL classes are being created for the first time, or have not been around that long, or there are not a lot of immigrant support services available. So you tend to see a very similar pattern. The big thing I would say is that the Hispanic population can be characterized by one other thing, which is its dispersion across the country, and a lot of that is immigrant families. So now we have Hispanic population growth in virtually all parts of the country, including places like Alaska, by the way. So this is really a story of dispersion, and it's one of a growing population in just about every corner of the country, just about every corner.
Susan Benton with the Urban Libraries Council. This is just such a wonderful presentation. I would echo what Lara has said about English as a second language, particularly in our urban centers. And, I think you're right. Certainly the Los Angeleses of the country are naturals, but our second-tier cities like Nashville and Omaha, Anchorage are also seeing the same as well. I also wanted to ask, because the services that are represented are fairly traditional, and I wondered whether you had done anything around immigrant-related services, because all of the anecdotal stories that we hear is that for many of recently arrived residents to the country, they've been told that the library is the first spot you should go for starting to get your footing in the community. And I wondered whether you'd gotten any data related to that.
It's an excellent question, and no, unfortunately, this survey didn't touch on or go deep into immigrant-specific services that are offered, let alone asking immigrant Hispanics about whether or not the library was one of the first places that they would go to for information about their local community. So unfortunately, no, it's not something that was a part of the survey. The other thing about this particular survey is it's great on the Hispanic side because we have the immigrant part on the Hispanic side, but it's important to note that there was not an immigrant there wasn't a question about are you an immigrant or not for non-Hispanics, and that the survey was not offered in other languages. So even if we did take a look at the immigrants who are non-Hispanic in this survey, more than likely they'd be the most the English-speaking from English-speaking countries, or perhaps the ones who have been here the longest, so that their connections are going to be very different than more recent arrivals. Yeah. But it's a good question.
Hi, good afternoon. I was wondering if you did any geographic or income demographic distinctions within the Hispanic immigration community in the United States.
So certainly at the center, we do an awful lot of work looking at the geographic distribution of the nation's Hispanic population, and offer a lot of products just on the basic characteristics of Hispanics in different parts of the country, both at the state level, at the metropolitan level, and also county level population estimates as well. For this particular survey, because the sample size is only 6,200 overall and 739 Hispanics overall, it really isn't designed for us to go deep into, say, what do the California, Texas, Floridas, Illinois, New Yorks, New Jerseys look like compared to everybody else? Or what is it like in, say, urban versus not urban? This is just, we'd be pushing the data a little bit too much, and it wasn't designed necessarily to give us those representative views in lower geographies.
Thank you. And I was thinking also of the other way around, whether there was any distinction about the immigration communities from the Latin American world, such as Chile versus the Caribbean and so forth.
Oh, absolutely, yes. There are some big distinctions. And, for example, the Mexican immigrant population is one that could be characterized by, more often than not, it is unauthorized. So about half of the Mexican immigrant population in the United States are unauthorized immigrants. That's not the case for Cubans. Virtually all are in the United States legally. And there are also differences in educational attainment and income. Cuban immigrants tend to be better educated and tend to do better, especially the longer they're here. Mexican immigrants tend to have less than a college degree, maybe even less than a high school diploma, and tend to work in positions or jobs like construction and agriculture. So there are some big distinctions across the Hispanic community in terms of its immigrant population. It's also interesting how differently it has settled. So, for example, Georgia's immigrant population is largely a Mexican immigrant population. In South Florida, though, it's largely Venezuelan, Colombian, Cuban, largely Latin American, South of Central America. And then, of course, in New York, it's largely Dominican. Dominicans are actually the single largest immigrant group, not just among Hispanics, but overall in the state of New York. So it's a very different combination of immigrant groups wherever you are. And I think one of the most fascinating things about the Latino community, and a story I really enjoy telling, is how diverse the community is on so many dimensions. And really one of the biggest is country of origin or Hispanic origin. So many fascinating patterns there, and we have a lot of products available at the Pew Hispanic Center website that could direct you to characteristics of these different groups.
Hi, my name is Eric Eldridge, and since I was young, I've always been passionate about libraries, and I hear news like on Good Morning America or NPR where Nancy Pearl, comes in as this iconic person who talks about libraries. And I'm wondering, forgive my ignorance, is there an equivalent of Nancy Pearl in the Latino library world that would be on programs?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't actually know. Somebody know? Somebody, I see heads shaking yes.
Nancy, if you're here, please stand up.
That's a great. That is really an interesting question. I hadn't thought about it that way. I'm going to be on the lookout for for such a person. Certainly, when you're watching Despierta America in the morning, they certainly have a lot of folks who have an equivalent in English. Like somebody who is the medical expert, somebody who is the like how to buy a home expert. So I actually don't know if they do or not. I'll ask around and see.
I have a suggestion.
Yes.
Pat Mora was the creator of Dia de los Niños de los Libros. And
Oh, yes.
She's been a huge proponent, and she would be the first person that would come to my mind, particularly around children, not as broad as Nancy Pearl, for instance, and more geared to the children and youth. But
Is she in
I would nominate her as food
Is she in San Antonio or in?
I believe she is in Texas. Yes.
Yes.
And is a librarian and also an author.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Pat Moore is a great idea, and she actually sits on the board of the National Book Festival. And so that's a really great answer. My question is somewhat related to that, because I'm thinking, as we're all speaking about cultural outreach to Hispanics, and I'm thinking about the preconceived notions and the prejudices and expectations that Hispanics would have. And when I think of the Iberian model, the Spain and Portugal, the libraries are strong institutions. When I think of the Latin American and Central American model, I don't see the ordinary public thronging to the libraries. In fact, they're considered places where scholarly elites go. And so that notion that we have in this country of a democratic library, an open sort of forum for the population really doesn't exist in the model. So I'm wondering, when you're looking at the foreign-born, and particularly the parents of the U.S. born, there's so much, they come from a different mental construct, really, about libraries. And what we're doing, in a way, is having to educate about what the American model of a library means. And I wonder if you would talk to that a little bit.
That's a fascinating comment. So one of the questions we've asked in our surveys of Hispanics has been, it's the following. Do you consider yourself a typical American or very different from a typical American? It's a very broad question. We don't define what a typical American is. We let people answer the question however they see fit. But I'd say one of the striking things about that particular question is how the foreign-born don't see themselves as a typical American. Perhaps no surprise, they're not from the United States. But I think that the question is picking up something of what you're pointing to, which is that there may be some cultural differences and people don't see themselves like a typical American overall. Now you look at the US-born, particularly the third generation, majority of them say, yeah, I'm a typical American, which I think is also quite interesting because a typical American can be all kinds of things. And one of the things I pick up from talking with young Latinos is that, US-born young Latinos, is that a typical American today is somebody who's diverse or comes from a diverse background. And so this whole sense of diversity and pride in your heritage is something that I think is now becoming part of the American, what it means to be American. So I do think that it's possible that some of these results, particularly about ease of use, even visiting libraries, knowing where they are, may be a reflection of what people are bringing from the countries that they come from and sort of what libraries are there. But it also is striking how their children who are born here, who go through U.S. school systems, end up looking a lot like, in their opinions, other Americans when it comes to their views of public libraries. So it may be, but we couldn't quite tell from this particular survey.
On the question of helping people using libraries to find jobs and applying for jobs, do you have additional information? Did you gather additional information regarding U.S. born and non-U.S. born, and also the types of jobs, for example, private versus government?
That's a good question. No, the survey didn't ask about the types of jobs, but certainly, as you can see here in this particular slide, the views of help finding and applying for a job is towards the bottom of the table. You can see that the foreign-born library user, Hispanic library user, 68% say that that's a very important service to them and their family. Among the U.S.-born, it's only 43%. So there is a big difference here, but you can also see among whites, only 20% say that it's an important service to them. For Hispanics overall, that's one of the more important services compared to whites and blacks.
Hi, my name is Linda Riley, and the question I have is about the greater appreciation of libraries for foreign-born Hispanics. Could that have something to do with the lady who mentioned the Iberian model and the Latin American model, meaning just access and just being used to libraries?
It could very well be. I think, though, it could also be the range of services that are offered. And so for the foreign-born, once they become a library user, when they find all the services that are available and they tell us that they value those services more than others do, that it may be a combination of their views of libraries overall, but also just literally what libraries are offering people, and they find it useful.
Good morning. I'm Barbara Robinson. I know that your population here and the depth in which you approach this couldn't get into this question, but there is clearly an issue about exposure to libraries in the schools. And I think given the assault that's going on school libraries in the United States and the orientation that you get, number one, if you have a school library, or number two, if your school makes the public library services known and used, is absolutely critical in looking at this universe and addressing the public policy issues and the resource allocation issues. I think Pew's been fabulous in its approach to looking at internet use, public library use, and I'm curious to know what your next cut is going to be at doing some data mining and also expanding the scope.
Yeah, thank you for the comment. And in terms of where we plan to go next, I need to talk to my colleague Lee Rainey to see what's on the horizon next for this. I have to say that walking over here and thinking about this presentation today, it occurred to me that there were some follow-ups that we could do, follow-ups partly around some of the things that folks were talking about here about what library services are offered in Spanish. I think actually that would be a nice short follow-up just for our readers at the Pew Research Center. But we also have other surveys that we've done around library use. And I was thinking that there might be an opportunity to do something around Hispanics in those other surveys, so more data mining of what we already have. But I need to check in with my colleague Lee to see sort of what might be next on the horizon for this.
Hi, thank you very much for this information. Just a few comments. One of the things that I noticed in looking at the ALA's, I guess, universe of institutions where they provide education for library science or library and information science, they're concentrated mostly on the East Coast. And so as you look into Texas and the Southwest, I believe Texas has 3 institutions, and they go smaller and smaller. I think California has 1 or 2, and that's about it. In contrast with the East Coast, where there's a greater concentration.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I say that because in growing up, and I'm foreign-born and Mexican and educated at the same time, so so I'm probably that small minority.
Did you grow up in Texas or California or?
In South Texas.
South Texas, okay.
And to the question as to how you feel, I used to feel like a normal American having grown up over there. Coming to the East Coast, I definitely feel like a minority. But because over in South Texas, it was a normal thing. But one of the things that I noticed at my public library was that the librarian only spoke in English. And that may have something to do with the fact that library science institutes are mostly East Coast instead of the Southwest. Recently, though, we have Mr. Randon in the town where I grew up, and so it was more engaged. But I do believe that there's also a shift. Having grown up there, I remember we used to go to the library a lot, particularly in the era before Staples and Kinko's, because you had to go and make copies there. But the other thing is that most public libraries, at least as I've seen them, they have limited access to internet. What I have noticed in places like Langley Park, Hispanic people are very innovative, so what they've done is they've set up like makeshift coffee, cyber cafes. And so because people need them for longer periods of time, they're willing to pay for these services. And I think there's limited access to these things. Just one more thing before we go. I think there's a huge difference between the migration patterns that occur in Mexico as opposed to South America. One of the major things that you see is that usually migration from South America is usually people from urban spaces, middle to upper class, because they are fleeing socialist regimes. In Mexico, usually the migration is not coming from urban spaces, they're coming from provincial spaces. So generally, they're not going to have access to a library there. If you go to any urban space in Mexico, you will see an educated class of people who do have access to libraries. Unfortunately, that's not the migration that we're getting from Mexico. did have some questions, but they escaped me, but I just felt like I had to clarify those things. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any additional questions?
Sorry, I actually just wanted to respond to a couple of things that had come up. One, that Lee Rainey and John Horgan will be speaking at the ALA annual conference in June, talking about the new data. So they'll be doing an update at the conference in San Francisco. And also, I think just within these numbers, something for the future, I think the internet, help finding jobs, and the government services, the disproportionate thing relates again to your point around access to the internet, because all of these services are moving online.
Yes.
So what we see is there's a huge correlation between this issue of applying for jobs or access to government services, and that there's across all categories, if you don't have other internet access in the library, you're going to see a disproportionate growth in those areas, because there's no other way now to apply for work or to apply for government services except through the internet, and that's just increasing entirely. And that there's also the University of Arizona, which is my alma mater, as a library school in the Southwest, which brings a lot of very diverse people into the community.
Ms. Brown, Dr. López, on behalf of the Hispanic Initiative of the Library of Congress, thank you very much for being so generous with your time and your knowledge.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.